Chapter 9. The Consortium. Sire, over what do you rule? Over everything, said the king, with magnificent simplicity. Le Petit Prince, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Cultural freedom did not come cheap. Over the next 17 years, the CIA was to pump tens of millions of dollars into the Congress for cultural freedom and related projects. With this kind of commitment, the CIA was in effect acting as America's Ministry of Culture. A central feature of the agency's efforts to mobilize culture as a Cold War weapon was the systematic organization of a network of private groups or friends into an unofficial consortium. This was an entrepreneurial coalition of philanthropic foundations, business corporations, and other institutions and individuals who worked hand in hand with the CIA to provide the cover and the funding pipeline for its secret programs in Western Europe. Additionally, these friends could be depended on to articulate the government's interests at home and abroad, whilst appearing to do so solely on their own initiative. Maintaining their private status, these individuals and bodies were in fact acting as the CIA's designated Cold War venture capitalists. The inspiration behind this consortium was Allen Dulles, who had started to build its foundations after the war, when he and his brother, John Foster Dulles, were partners at the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. In May 1949, Allen Dulles presided over the formation of the National Committee for a Free Europe, ostensibly the initiative of a group of private American citizens, but in reality one of the CIA's most ambitious fronts. Incorporated on the 11th of May 1949 in New York, the declared purpose of the National Committee for a Free Europe, Inc., was to use the many and varied skills of exiled East Europeans in the development of programs which will actively combat Soviet domination. One committed to the belief that this struggle can be resolved as much by force of ideas as by physical means, the committee was soon to extend its reach into all areas of the cultural Cold War. The State Department is very happy to see the formation of this group, announced Secretary of State Dean Acheson. It thinks that the purpose of this organization is excellent and is glad to welcome its entrance into this field and give it its hearty endorsement. This public blessing was intended to mask the official origins of the committee and the fact that it operated solely at the discretion of the CIA, which provided 90% financial support through unvouchered funds. Behind Acheson's endorsement was another concealed truth. Although the committee's founding statute included the clause, "No part of the activities of the corporation shall be the carrying on of propaganda," this was precisely and specifically what it was designed to do. Moving to the CIA in December 1950, Allen Dulles became the Great White Case Officer of the National Committee for a Free Europe, working with Carmel Offee, who had overseen it for Wisner's OPC since its creation a year earlier. Dulles now took charge of organizing its committees, securing its budget allocation, and designing its strategies. One of the earliest pioneers of the Quango, Dulles understood that the success of America's Cold War program depended on its ability to appear independent from government, to seem to represent the spontaneous convictions of freedom-loving individuals. 4. For this aspect alone, the National Committee for a Free Europe, Inc., serves as the paradigm for the CIA-led corporatization of the foreign policy machinery in the Cold War period. Proliferating committees and subcommittees, boards of directors and trustees, the National Committee for a Free Europe boasted a membership which read like who's who in America. Interconnectedness was vital, and gave new meaning to Paul Valéry's jokey comment that it was the ambition of Europeans to be governed by a committee of Americans. There was Lucius Clay, who as High Commissioner in Germany had given the green light to Der Monat, Gardner Cowles, president of the Cowles Publishing Group and a trustee of the Farfield Foundation, Henry Ford II, president of General Motors, Oveta Culp Hobby, a Museum of Modern Art trustee who allowed several family foundations to be used as CIA conduits, the Cold War Cardinal, Francis Spellman, C.D. Jackson, psychological warfare veteran and Time Life executive, John C. Hughes, U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Junkie Fleischman, Arthur Schlesinger, Cecil B. DeMille, Spiros Skouras, Daryl Zanuck, and Dwight D. Eisenhower. There were businessmen and lawyers, diplomats and Marshall Plan administrators, advertising executives and media moguls, film directors and journalists, trades unionists, and of course, CIA agents. Plenty of them. These men were all witting. To the agency, a witting individual was a man of their world. He knew the language, the code words, the customs, the recognition symbols. To be witting was to belong to the club, to talk the language, to understand the high signs, to know the fraternity grip. The unwitting was out in the cold, unaware of what went on around him, ignorant of the elite conceptions that guided the closed circle of intelligence. 5. Recalling the ease with which he could engage his fellow Americans in covert projects, CIA agent Donald Jameson said, "There was almost nobody in this country that I couldn't go to in those days and say, 'I'm from the CIA and I'd like to ask you about so-and-so,' and at the very least, get a respectful reception and a discussion." 6 CIA agents rarely had to knock. The door was open. Just 12 months after its creation, this nucleus of private operators had advanced Dulles' Free Europe Committee, as it became known, from its tentative beginnings into a broad and well-defined program with operations on a very substantial scale. It was an instrument in hand, timely, already well-fashioned for pursuing the victory of ideas. Its personnel numbered 413, of which 201 were Americans, many of European origin, and 212 specialist exiles from Eastern Europe. The budget for its first year alone was $1,703,266. A separate budget of $10 million was set aside for Radio Free Europe, RFE, founded in Berlin in 1950 under the auspices of the committee. Within a few years, RFE had 29 stations broadcasting in 16 different languages and was using every trick of oratory known to Demosthenes or Cicero in its Philippics against every individual who supports the Stalinist regime. 8. It was also soliciting the services of informers behind the Iron Curtain, monitoring communist broadcasts, underwriting anti-communist lectures and writings by Western intellectuals, and distributing its research internationally to scholars and journalists, including those affiliated with the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The fundraising arm of the Free Europe Committee was the Crusade for Freedom, for which a young actor named Ronald Reagan was a leading spokesman and publicist. The Crusade for Freedom was used to launder money to support a program run by Bill Casey, the future CIA director, called the International Refugee Committee in New York, which allegedly coordinated the exfiltration of Nazis from Germany to the States, where they were expected to assist the government in its struggle against communism. Dulles kept a firm grip on the committee by placing CIA officers in key positions. If a problem arose which needed to be resolved out of channels, Dulles would simply call a meeting with the committee's principals in a New York club or hotel. Top-secret documents record a series of such meetings convened by Dulles at the Knickerbocker Club and the Drake Hotel, in this case, in a bedroom booked for the occasion. How many Cold War campaigns were waged from hotel bedrooms? Other meetings were held in Allen Dulles' or Frank Wisner's offices at CIA headquarters. The USA was a big operation, very big, says the narrator of Humboldt's Gift. Commenting on the dedication of America's elite as they manned this privateer, Henry Kissinger wrote, "It is to the lasting credit of that generation of Americans that they assumed these responsibilities with energy, imagination, and skill. By helping Europe rebuild, encouraging European unity, shaping the institutions of economic cooperation, and extending the protection of our alliances, they saved the possibility of freedom. This burst of creativity is one of the glorious moments of American history." 9. Henry Breck, a CIA case officer and alumnus of Groton School, expressed it another way. "Of course, if you're in a real war, you must fight hard, and the upper classes fight the hardest. They have the most to lose." When they were not huddled together in clubs or hotel rooms, Breck's upper classes applied themselves with equal commitment to the business of entertaining. Lively, self-confident, voluble, Wisner and his colleagues were driven to enjoy a good party, just as they were driven to save the world from communism. Wisner loved to do a dance called the Crab Walk. Angleton, a legendary consumer of martinis and, sometimes, anything he could get hold of, used to dance freeform to Elvis Presley tunes at parties, weaving enthusiastically and often by himself. Maurice Oldfield, chief of MI6, known as C, also loved to dance. Maurice would come visit us in Rhode Island and dance under the trees at night, recalled Janet Barnes, taught 10. As the world became stranger, the pattern more complicated, theirs was indeed a lifetime burning in every moment. It seems amazing that men who partied so hard and drank so prodigiously continued to function in their day jobs. The brokers of a new world order, they delayed burnout only because the potential gains were so immense. Back at their desks the next day, they busied themselves with finding new ways of securing their investments and enlarging their assets. We generally reached out to find Americans who would consent to take the money into their accounts and then use it to contribute in various ways, said Covert Action Agent William Colby. If you went to any American institution, company, anything else, and said, "Will you help your country by passing this money?" they'd salute and say, "Absolutely, I'd be delighted." It's easy to pass money around the world to the desired end objective. It might not be one bulk payment, but various small payments going in the right direction. This goes all the way to the rather more naked thing that I was sometimes engaged in, putting bundles of local currency in the back of my car and driving out and transferring them to another fellow's car. The American companies and individuals who agreed to collaborate with the agency in this way were known as quiet channels. These channels could also be established after contact was made the other way round. Oftentimes, private American groups came to us, remembered Case Officer Lee Williams. We didn't just always go to them. There was a commonality of purpose that seemed to us to dissolve any major concern about the morality of what we were doing. 12. In 1956, in the wake of the Hungarian uprising, J.M. Kaplan, president of the Welch Grape Juice Company, and president and treasurer of the Kaplan Foundation, assets $14 million, wrote to Allen Dulles offering his services in the fight against communism. Kaplan offered to devote his unending energy to utilize every idea and ingenuity to the overriding aim of breaking up the communist conspiracy, searching out and working out every practical opportunity. 13 Dulles subsequently arranged for a CIA representative to make an appointment with Kaplan. The Kaplan Foundation could soon be counted as an asset, a reliable pass-through for secret funds earmarked for CIA projects, amongst them the Congress for Cultural Freedom and an institute headed by veteran socialist and chairman of the American Committee for Cultural Freedom, Norman Thomas. The use of philanthropic foundations was the most convenient way to pass large sums of money to agency projects without alerting the recipients to their source. By the mid-1950s, the CIA's intrusion into the foundation field was massive. Although figures are not available for this period, the General Counsel of a 1952 Congress committee appointed to investigate U.S. foundations concluded that an unparalleled amount of power is concentrated increasingly in the hands of an interlocking and self-perpetuating group. Unlike the power of corporate management, it is unchecked by stockholders. Unlike the power of government, it is unchecked by the people. Unlike the power of the churches, it is unchecked by any firmly established canons of value. In 1976, a select committee appointed to investigate U.S. intelligence activities reported on the CIA's penetration of the foundation field by the mid-1960s. During 1963-6, of the 700 grants over $10,000 given by 164 foundations, at least 108 involved partial or complete CIA funding. More importantly, CIA funding was involved in nearly half the grants made by these 164 foundations in the field of international activities during the same period. Bona fide foundations such as Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie were considered the best and most plausible kind of funding cover. 15, a CIA study of 1966, argued that this technique was particularly effective for democratically run membership organizations which need to assure their own unwitting members and collaborators, as well as their hostile critics, that they have genuine, respectable, private sources of income. Certainly, it allowed the CIA to fund a seemingly limitless range of covert action programs affecting youth groups, labor unions, universities, publishing houses, and other private institutions from the early 1950s. 16. There was a cover branch at CIA whose job it was to help provide cover, like the foundations we used for our operations, Braden explained. I paid no attention to the details. The finance department would handle it and talk to the cover officer. It was just a mechanism which you used. The Farfield Foundation was one of them. I don't know the names of all of them, I can't remember, but it was a crisscross of money. There was never any danger of the CIA running out of money. 17. The crisscross of money filtered its way through a raft of host foundations, some acting as fronts, some as conduits. Known to have wittingly facilitated CIA funding passes, were over 170 foundations, including the Hoblitzell Foundation, a pass-through for the Farfield, the Litauer Foundation, a donor to the Farfield, the Miami District Fund, another donor to the Farfield, the Price Fund, a CIA dummy, the Rab Charitable Foundation, which received CIA money from the phony Price Fund, then passed it to the Farfield, the Vernon Fund, like the Farfield, a CIA dummy front with a rubber stamp board of directors, and the Whitney Trust. On their board sat the cream of America's social, financial, and political establishment. Not for nothing did these foundations announce themselves as private. Later, the joke was that if any American philanthropic or cultural organization carried the words free or private in its literature, it must be a CIA front. This was the consortium at work, calling in favors across the old-school TIE network, the OSS network, the boardrooms of America. The board of the Farfield Foundation alone provides a fascinating map of these intricate linkages. Junkie Fleischman, its president, was a contract consultant for Wisner's OPC, and thereafter a witting CIA cover for the Congress for Cultural Freedom. His cousin, Jay Holmes, was president of the Holmes Foundation, incorporated in 1953 in New York. Holmes began making small contributions to the Congress for Cultural Freedom in 1957. From 1962, the Holmes Foundation acted formally as a pass-through for CIA money to the Congress. The Fleischman Foundation, of which Junkie was president, was also listed as a donor to the Farfield Foundation. Also on the board of the Fleischman Foundation was Charles Fleischman, Junkie's nephew, who was brought into the Farfield as a director in the early 1960s. Another Farfield trustee was Cass Canfield, one of the most distinguished of American publishers. He was a director of Grosser and Dunlap, Bantam Books, and director and chairman of the editorial board of Harper Brothers. Canfield was the American publisher of The God That Failed. He enjoyed prolific links to the world of intelligence, both as a former psychological warfare officer and as a close personal friend of Allen Dulles, whose memoirs The Craft of Intelligence he published in 1963. Canfield had also been an activist and fundraiser for the United World Federalists in the late 1940s. Its then president was Cord Meyer, later Tom Braden's deputy, who revealed that one technique that we used was to encourage those of our members who had influential positions in professional organizations, trade associations, or labor unions to lobby for passage at their annual conventions of resolutions favorable to our cause. 18. In 1954, Canfield headed up a Democratic Committee on the Arts. He was later one of the founding members of ENTA, American National Theater and Academy, reactivated in 1945 as the equivalent of the Foreign Affairs branch of American Theater, alongside Jock Whitney, another of the CIA's quiet channels. Canfield was a friend of Frank Platt, also a Farfield director, and a CIA agent. In the late 1960s, Platt helped Michael Josselson get a job with Canfield at Harper's. Canfield was also a trustee of the France-America Society, alongside C.D. Jackson, Grayson Kirk, president of Columbia University, David Rockefeller, and William Burden, who was its president. William Armistead Moel Burden, as well as being president of the France-America Society, was a director of the Farfield. A great-great-grandson of Commodore Vanderbilt, Burden was a key presence in the American establishment. He was a member and director of the Council on Foreign Relations, a private think tank made up of America's corporate and social elite, which acted as a kind of shadow foreign policy-making unit. Other members included Allen Dulles, John McCloy, and David Rockefeller. During the war, he worked for Nelson Rockefeller's intelligence outfit and sat as chairman of an advisory committee of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. In 1956, he became president of the museum. In that year, he also sat on the State Department's Books Abroad Advisory Committee. Formerly Assistant Secretary of State for Air, he was a financier who had special interests in aviation financing, having been associated with Brown Brothers, Harriman and Company, and Scudder, Stevens and Clark in New York, and a director of numerous companies, including American Metal Company Limited, Union Sulphur and Oil Corporation, Cerro de Pasco Corporation, and the Hanover Bank. He was a visiting member of faculty committees at Harvard and MIT, co-chairman of the government-sponsored Salute to France, Paris, Spring 1955, and U.S. ambassador to Brussels in 1960. Another Farfield executive was Gardner Cowles, a donor of the Iowa-based Gardner Cowles Foundation, whose substantial tax-exempt assets came from the huge profits of the Cowles Magazines and Broadcasting Company, of which he was president. He was also a corporate member of the Crusade for Freedom and a sponsor of the periodical History, published by the Society of American Historians and funded by private donations. The journal was as much a product of the Cold War as the Crusade for Freedom, and included in its list of sponsors William Donovan, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Allen Dulles, and Henry Luce. The longest-serving executive director of the Farfield Foundation was John Jack Thompson, who held the post from 1956 to 1965. Thompson was recruited to the CIA by Cord Meyer, whom he had known since 1945, when both were assistants to the U.S. delegation at the San Francisco Conference convened to establish the structure of the new United Nations organization. Formerly a student at Columbia under Lionel Trilling, Thompson was well known in New York literary circles. Jennifer Josselson, Michael's daughter, referred to him as Uncle Jack. Other Farfield directors included William Vanden Heuvel, a New York lawyer who was close to both John and Bobby Kennedy, and to Arthur Schlesinger. He was also a board member of the Emergency Rescue Committee, alongside William Donovan and Cass Canfield. Joseph Verner Reed, president of Triton Press, vice president of the Hobe Sound Company, Florida, and a member of the Drama Advisory Panel for the International Exchange Program of ANTA. Fred Lazarus, Jr., chief donor of the Fred Lazarus Foundation, which in 1956 made a substantial contribution to the Farfield, and later an advisory member of the National Endowment for the Arts. Donald Stralem, president of United Community Defense Services, Inc., and donor, along with his wife Jean, to the Shelter Rock Foundation, which piggybacked CIA money destined for the Congress for Cultural Freedom into the Farfield coffers in 1962, the year in which Stralem replaced Fleischman as president of the Farfield. Whitelaw Reid, former editor of the New York Herald Tribune. Ralph P. Haynes, director of the Haynes Foundation, North Carolina. A good friend of Junkies, Haynes and his wife Barbara cruised with the Fleischmans and the Wisners in the Bahamas. Finally, of course, there was Michael Josselson, whose name appeared on the Foundation's letterhead as its international director, and who received his CIA salary through the Foundation. Farfield was by no means exceptional in its incestuous character. This was the nature of power in America at this time. The system of private patronage was the preeminent model of how small, homogeneous groups came to defend America's, and by definition, their own interests. Serving at the top of the pile was every self-respecting WASP's ambition. The prize was a trusteeship on either the Ford Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation, both of which were conscious instruments of covert U.S. foreign policy, with directors and officers who were closely connected to, or even members of American intelligence. Incorporated in 1936, the Ford Foundation was the tax-exempt cream of the vast Ford fortune, with assets totaling over $3 billion by the late 1950s. Dwight McDonald described it memorably as a large body of money completely surrounded by people who want some. The architects of the Foundation's cultural policy in the aftermath of the Second World War were perfectly attuned to the political imperatives which supported America's looming presence on the world stage. At times, it seemed as if the Ford Foundation was simply an extension of government in the area of international cultural propaganda. The Foundation had a record of close involvement in covert actions in Europe, working closely with Marshall Plan and CIA officials on specific projects. This reciprocity was further extended when Marshall Planner Richard Bissell, under whose signature counterpart funds were signed over to Frank Wisner, came to the Ford Foundation in 1952 accurately predicting there was nothing to prevent an individual from exerting as much influence through his work in a private foundation as he could through work in the government. 19. During his tenure at Ford, Bissell met often with Allen Dulles and other CIA officials, including former Groton classmate Tracy Barnes, in a mutual search for new ideas. He left suddenly to join the CIA as a special assistant to Allen Dulles in January 1954, but not before he had helped steer the foundation to the vanguard of Cold War thinking. Bissell had worked directly under Paul Hoffman, who became president of the Ford Foundation in 1950. Arriving straight from his job as administrator of the Marshall Plan, Hoffman had received a full immersion course in the problems of Europe and in the power of ideas to address those problems. He was fluent in the language of psychological warfare, and echoing Arthur Koestler's cry of 1950, "Friends, freedom has seized the offensive," he talked of waging peace. He also shared the view of Ford Foundation spokesman Robert Maynard Hutchins that the State Department was subjected to so much domestic political interference that it can no longer present a rounded picture of American culture. One of the Ford Foundation's first post-war ventures into international cultural diplomacy was the launch in 1952 of the Intercultural Publications Program under James Laughlin, the publisher of the New Directions series, which published George Orwell and Henry Miller, and a revered custodian of the interests of the avant-garde. With an initial grant of $500,000, Laughlin launched the magazine Perspectives, which was targeted at the non-communist left in France, England, Italy, and Germany, and published in all those languages. Its aim, he emphasized, was not so much to defeat the leftist intellectuals in dialectical combat as to lure them away from their positions by aesthetic and rational persuasion. Further, it would promote peace by increasing respect for America's non-materialistic achievements among intellectuals abroad. Its board packed with cultural cold warriors, the Intercultural Publications Program also targeted those American intellectuals who felt their work was undermined by the prevailing stereotype of America as a mass cult hell. Malcolm Cowley was an early supporter of Perspectives, which offered a version of America far removed from movies, hard-boiled detective stories, comic books, and magazines in which there is more advertising than text. One academic, Perry Miller, argued that no propaganda for the American way should be included. That omission will in itself become the most important element of propaganda in the best sense. 21 Perspectives never lived up to these expectations. Irving Kristol referred to it as that miserable Ford Foundation journal. 22. In the wake of its failure, the Ford Foundation was easily persuaded to take over sponsorship of Lasky's Der Monat. Set up under Lucius Clay's backing in October 1948 and financed through the confidential fund of the American High Commission, Der Monat's official auspices strained its claims to be independent. Lasky longed to replace this subsidy, and with the help of Shepard Stone, a foundation executive who had worked under Clay in Germany, he finally secured a grant from the Ford Foundation, declaring in the October 1954 issue, "From now on, we are absolutely and completely free and independent." On the 21st of January 1953, Allen Dulles, insecure about his future in the CIA under the newly elected Eisenhower, had met his friend David Rockefeller for lunch. Rockefeller hinted heavily that if Dulles decided to leave the agency, he could reasonably expect to be invited to become president of the Ford Foundation. Dulles need not have feared for his future. 2 days after this lunch, the New York Times broke the story that Alien Dulles was to become director of Central Intelligence. The new president of the Ford Foundation was announced shortly after. He was John McCloy, the archetype of 20th century American power and influence. By the time he came to the Ford Foundation, he had been Assistant Secretary of War, President of the World Bank, and High Commissioner of Germany. In 1953, he also became chairman of the Rockefellers' then Chase Manhattan Bank and chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. After John F. Kennedy's assassination, he was a Warren Commission appointee. Throughout, he maintained his career as a Wall Street attorney for the 7 big oil companies and as director of numerous corporations. As High Commissioner in Germany, McCloy had agreed to provide cover for scores of CIA agents, including Lawrence de Neufville. Although officially employees in his administration, unofficially they were accountable to their chiefs in Washington, who were under few obligations to tell McCloy what they were really up to. A political sophisticate, McCloy took a pragmatic view of the CIA's inevitable interest in the Ford Foundation when he assumed its presidency. Addressing the concerns of some of the foundation's executives, who felt that its reputation for integrity and independence was being undermined by involvement with the CIA, McCloy argued that if they failed to cooperate, the CIA would simply penetrate the foundation quietly by recruiting or inserting staff at the lower levels. McCloy's answer to this problem was to create an administrative unit within the Ford Foundation specifically to deal with the CIA. Headed by McCloy and 2 foundation officers, this 3-man committee had to be consulted every time the agency wanted to use the foundation, either as a pass-through or as cover. They would check in with this particular committee, and if it was felt that this was a reasonable thing and would not be against the foundation's long-term interests, then the project would be passed along to the internal staff and other foundation officers, without them knowing the origins of the proposal. 23, explained McCloy's biographer, Kai Bird. With this arrangement in place, the Ford Foundation became officially engaged as one of those organizations the CIA was able to mobilize for political warfare against communism. The Foundation's archives reveal a raft of joint projects. The East European Fund, a CIA front in which George Kennan played a prominent role, got most of its money from the Ford Foundation. The fund forged close links with the Chekhov Publishing House, which received $523,000 from the Ford Foundation for the purchase of prescribed Russian works and translations into Russian of Western classics. The foundation gave $500,000 to Bill Casey's International Rescue Committee and substantial grants to another CIA front, the World Assembly of Youth. It was also one of the single largest donors to the Council on Foreign Relations, an independent think tank which exerted enormous influence on American foreign policy and which operated, and continues to operate, according to strict confidentiality rules, which include a 25-year embargo on the release of its records. Under a major grant from the Ford Foundation, the Institute of Contemporary Arts, founded in Washington in 1947, expanded its international program in 1958. On the ICA's Board of Trustees sat William Bundy, a member of the CIA's Board of National Estimates, and son-in-law of former Secretary of State Dean Acheson. His brother, George Bundy, became president of the Ford Foundation in 1966, coming straight from his job as special assistant to the president in charge of national security, which meant, among other things, monitoring the CIA. Benefiting from the foundation's largesse were Herbert Reed, Salvador de Madariaga, Stephen Spender, Aaron Copland, Isaac Dinesen, Nam Gabo, Martha Graham, Robert Lowell, Robert Penn Warren, and Robert Richmond, who were all fellows of the ICA's Congress of Cultural Leaders. This was in effect an extension of the work of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which itself was one of Ford Foundation's largest grantees, receiving $7 million by the early 1960s. One of the earliest CIA supporters of the Congress for Cultural Freedom was Frank Lindsay, to whom de Neufville was reporting in the build-up to the 1950 Berlin Conclave. Lindsay was an OSS veteran who in 1947 had written one of the first memos recommending that the U.S. create a covert action force to fight the Cold War. The paper attracted the attention of Frank Wisner, who asked him to come on board and run his European operations at OPC. As deputy chief of OPC, 1949 to 51, Lindsay was responsible for setting up the stay-behind groups in Western Europe. In 1953, he joined the Ford Foundation, and from there he maintained close contact with his confreres in the intelligence community. Lindsay was later joined at the foundation by Waldemar Nielsen, who became its staff director. Throughout his tenure there, Nielsen was a CIA agent. In 1960, he became executive director of the President's Committee on Information Activities Abroad. In his various guises, Nielsen worked closely with C.D. Jackson, with whom he shared a contempt for the fundamental disregard for psychological factors among a good many of the Haut's fonctionnaires in this town. Nielsen was also a close friend of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, whose efforts he wholeheartedly supported. The key link between the Congress and the Ford Foundation was Shepard Stone, who had established a reputation as an expert in the structure and procedures by which the American government and private groups participated in world affairs. The Sunday editor of the New York Times before the war, he went on to serve with G2, Army Intelligence, before becoming director of public affairs under John McCloy in Germany, in which guise he had secured government sponsorship for Der Monat. An old hand at psychological warfare, John McCloy thought highly enough of Stone to recommend him as a worthy successor to the outgoing director of the Psychological Strategy Board in 1951. Stone did not get the job and instead joined the Ford Foundation. Throughout his career, he was so closely connected to the CIA that many believed he was an agency man. Shep was not a CIA man, though he may have fished in those waters. 24, one agent commented vaguely. In 1953, he spent a month in Europe at Joselson's invitation, visiting key congresspeople. As director of the Ford Foundation's International Affairs Division from 1954, Stone's value to the Congress was further enhanced. The Rockefeller Foundation, no less than the Ford, was an integral component of America's Cold War machinery. Incorporated in 1913, its principal donor was the legendary John D. Rockefeller III. It had assets exceeding $500 million, not including an additional $150 million in the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Inc., a major think tank which was incorporated in New York in 1940. In 1957, the fund brought together the most influential minds of the period under a special studies project whose task was to attempt a definition of American foreign policy. Subpanel 2 was designated to the study of international security objectives and strategy, and its members included Henry and Claire Booth Luce, Lawrence Rockefeller, Townsend Hoops, representing Jock Whitney's company, Nelson Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, Frank Lindsay, and William Bundy of the CIA. The convergence between the Rockefeller billions and the U.S. government exceeded even that of the Ford Foundation. John Foster Dulles and later Dean Rusk both went from the presidency of the Rockefeller Foundation to become secretaries of state. Other Cold War heavies such as John J. McCloy and Robert A. Lovett featured prominently as Rockefeller trustees. Nelson Rockefeller's central position on this foundation guaranteed a close relationship with U.S. intelligence circles. He had been in charge of all intelligence in Latin America during the Second World War. Later, his associate in Brazil, Colonel J.C. King, became CIA chief of clandestine activities in the Western Hemisphere. When Nelson Rockefeller was appointed by Eisenhower to the National Security Council in 1954, his job was to approve various covert operations. If he needed any extra information on CIA activities, he could simply ask his old friend Allen Dulles for a direct briefing. One of the most controversial of these activities was the CIA's MK-Ultra, or Manchurian Candidate, program of mind control research during the 1950s. This research was assisted by grants from the Rockefeller Foundation, running his own intelligence department during the war. Nelson Rockefeller had been absent from the ranks of OSS, and indeed had formed a lifelong enmity with William Donovan. But there was no prejudice against OSS veterans who were recruited to the Rockefeller Foundation in droves. In 1950, OSSer Charles B. Foz became head of the Foundation's Division of Humanities. His assistant was another OSS veteran named Chadbourne Gilpatrick, who arrived there directly from the CIA. These two were the principal liaisons for the Congress for Cultural Freedom and responsible for dispensing large Rockefeller subsidies to Joselson's outfit. As important as Nelson Rockefeller was his brother, David, he controlled the donations committee of the Chase Manhattan Bank Foundation, was vice president, then president of the bank itself, a trustee of the Council on Foreign Relations, chairman of the Executive Committee for International House, and a close personal friend of Allen Dulles and Tom Braden. I often briefed David, semi-officially and with Allen's permission, on what we were doing, recalled Braden. He was of the same mind as us, and very approving of everything we were doing. He had the same sense as I did that the way to win the Cold War was our way. Sometimes David would give me money to do things which weren't in our budget. He gave me a lot of money for causes in France. I remember he gave me $50,000 for someone who was active in promoting a united Europe amongst European youth groups. This guy came to me with his project, and I told David, and David just gave me the check for $50,000. The CIA never came into the equation. 25. These freelance transactions gave new meaning to the practice of governmental buccaneering and were an inevitable byproduct of the semi-privatization of American foreign policy during these Cold War years. Out of the same culture, however, came later Oliver North-type disasters. The comparison is apt, for just like the architect of Iran Gate, with his steadfast gaze, his inexorable sense of mission, and his palpable conviction that the end justifies the means. 26. These earlier friends of the CIA were never once afflicted by doubt in themselves or their purposes.